Hello, my friend, and welcome to Beyond, the personal growth podcast for the people who are healing beyond their conditioning and beyond the cycles that played out before them. My name is Katie Lynn, and with 20 years of experience in the field of psychology and human behavior, I am bringing my natural curiosity, expertise, and personal life experiences here for discussions that are guaranteed to be informative, inspiring, and entertaining. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. Today on the podcast, I have the incredible Jen Underwood, who literally fell, I think, from the heavens, if I had to identify the way that she showed up in my world, into my Facebook timeline. And I jumped in immediately to begin learning from her and experiencing her work. And really, what Jen has shown herself to be about is vulnerability, and particularly vulnerability in business, vulnerability in content creation. And so, Jen, thank you so much for being here. I'm so grateful to have you.
I am so happy to be here. I think that's my favorite way that anyone's ever come into my world. So thank you, Facebook timeline.
Yes. Thank you to the Facebook timeline for just connecting us, right? The algorithm did its thing that day.
Sometimes it works. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it works in our favor.
Yes. And so, I thought the work that you're creating in the world and giving so generously of yourself in is this vulnerability conversation. And really within the context of vulnerability as a superpower and a strength, particularly in business, which had my ears perk up, because if you would have told me this 8, 10, even 5 years ago, I would have done like that, huh? Like what? Vulnerability, this is business. I came into business so I didn't have to be vulnerable, Jen. So what are you saying? And so for me, when I heard vulnerability and people used to say, Katie, you got to be vulnerable. Katie, maybe you should be more vulnerable. I felt like a 3-year-old whose parent was like, you just have to tie your shoes. And I'm like, well, that's cute. And I would love to tie my shoes, but I have no idea where to even begin with that. So can you tell us more about vulnerability as a superpower and your work?
So for you or anyone who knows about the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 8, which is definitely the least vulnerable of all the Enneagram numbers. Like, our superpower is to deny that vulnerability exists, basically.
Same. In fact, I had an awakening like maybe a year and a half ago that I'm like, I thought I was a 3.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh no, this rage here, this rage here, this is 8. This is 8 written all over it.
I wonder. That's why I was like, I just have this feeling that you and me might be kind of similar on this.
Yeah.
It's like, no. Like, vulnerability is weakness. Emotions are weakness. Like, we don't show that to people. And about 10 plus years ago at this point, I was like, okay, there are a lot of things that are not working in my life. And I got to figure this out, right? And I got to break it down. And at that point, I was a therapist. I had master's in counseling. I had like done all this studying work, but not a lot of personal work. And I went through a series of different modalities and trainings and workshops, and then found this one particular group where it was like the most horrifically vulnerable thing you could do, like pull that out and show everyone. And I was like, these people are crazy.
Yes.
And then the more I did it, I was like, I feel better. And that's really interesting. And so that kind of like that kickstarted my journey. And a lot of it was just that was like relational work, right? Like, how do you just like be a better friend and be a better lover and a better partner and a better parent? And a lot of my work is still in that area. But then as I worked in more and more businesses, I've been an entrepreneur for just as long, or longer at this point. And the more I worked in business, I was like, okay, why aren't people applying this to business? Like, why aren't we looking? Business is another relation. That's a relationship. You have a relationship to your business. If you're in the business of people, which a lot of us are,
yes,
me and you are, that's all relationship building. And every good business owner will tell you that most of business is relationships. It's networking. It's it's all these relational tendencies, right? It's building
Mm-hmm.
a team. We have all these conversations around, even in corporate spaces, around like, what is the company values and the culture, and those are all relationship conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But relationships are built on vulnerability.
that
And
part.
so you can't have one without the other. And it was just this huge disconnect of like, oh, but we don't do vulnerability in business spaces. And I was like, okay, but
Yeah.
do we do relationships in business spaces? Because if
Mm-hmm.
so, we have to learn to do vulnerability in business spaces. And that really kicked off the majority of my work now.
Yeah. And it's fascinating for me to hear you say this out loud because it really did feel like that 10 to 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when my journey in business really started. Cause I mean, in high school, I didn't know what an entrepreneur was. Never heard of it. You just go get a job. Then when I realized what that was, I was like, oh, that sounds really nice. That sounds like fun. Let's go give it a shot. But I really don't think that we consciously thought of it as a relationship business. Whereas now we're actually seeing the trend of even products being like relationship businesses, where we're framing physical products as a relationship and within the context of relationships that these influencers or marketers have with their audiences and storylines, which was a big component of the space that I was in with you, which was telling stories, sharing stories, right? And really how powerful that is in terms of that connection piece of feeling like we're seen and we belong and we're understood, especially when we're in this space of social media, giving us so much access. And also, I don't feel more connected than ever. Ironically, it's like, oh, there actually is this disconnection and there's so many options. And how do I find the one that is for me? And it usually comes down to what is the one that makes me feel most seen, most heard, most understood. And that's relationships, right? It's like, who do you partner with? You partner with the person who you feel most seen, heard, understood, and probably loved unconditionally, hopefully.
Yeah. Who do I like the most?
Mm-hmm.
It's really like, like we do this constantly and we
Mm-hmm.
always have. And I love that you brought up influencers because it is really interesting to look at like how someone who's trying to sell a product will bring in an influencer to talk about that product because you're more likely to buy it if someone
Yeah.
that you like is talking
Mm-hmm.
about it.
Yeah. And I don't know why we call them influencers. They really should be like relationship builders or like, like connectors, because that's really what they're so good at. They're so good at making you feel seen, understood, and connected with in the way that you need that, right? Because not every influencer is going to resonate. But there are the ones where even me, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. Right. I can imagine us having lunch together. I can imagine us being friends in real life. And that's fun. But the question that I have now is, okay, so we have a frame within which we can see relationships and vulnerability are very important for business, for our life in general, right? There's that study that's like people who live longer reportedly just over their lifespan have better quality relationships, higher quality relationships, has a direct influence on health, physical health, mental health, all of that. So how do we do it, Jen?
How do we get vulnerable?
How do we
I
do it?
mean, the basics of vulnerability is the thing that you don't want to say, you have to say it. That's
Yes.
basically it. Like it's that simple. Like it just is horrible. And there
Yes.
is and there's a much, of course there's so many more layers, but it's like, what is the thing that you think that you can't say? And it's not always what we think that we can't say because we have these lovely strategic brains
Mm-hmm.
that like to have 1 million different strategies and ways to tell us to not do things, particularly to
Yeah.
be vulnerable. And so sometimes for some people, it's, I can't say that. For other people, it's, no one would want to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't matter. Well,
Yeah.
that's stupid. That's basic. That's not important enough, not unique enough. It's not worth saying. Everyone already knows that. No one would want to hear that. That's embarrassing.
Mm.
It's bad or wrong. Sometimes it's just like, oh, it's just not interesting or funny.
Yeah.
Like we have a million different frames of
Yeah.
I can't, I shouldn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, almost always underneath that is just a like fear of what happens if I do say it and people don't like it and therefore me.
Yes. Oh my goodness. I really pray that everybody took notes of all those prompts you just gave us so generously of I shouldn't say that, right? I can't say that. It might be dumb if I say because I relate to all of those. And even I feel like my defense mechanisms personally got so good that it would not even register as a sort of starter line anymore. I would just dismiss it.
Yep.
And so part of my unlearning, right, of that defense and that shielding has been like, wait, why did I just dismiss that? Bring it back into the room. Let's sit with it. And I liken it to my process with vulnerability. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this. But my process of vulnerability is really like my toddler, my 3-year-old, he's got this bucket of Hot Wheels, right? And like monster truck cars and motorcycles. And right, like he's my planes, trains, and automobiles kid. And so like when we get to playing, he'll be like, Mom, where is my orange motorcycle? And I'm like, I have no idea. You have 100 of them. And so he takes the whole bucket out and he dumps it, right? And it makes this clanging noise and it's like messy. And my mom organized brain goes like, oh my gosh, I'm going to clean this up in like 10 minutes. But that's sort of what my process looks like when I'm processing something and working in my vulnerability is like, I've got to dump it all out and then I can sort through it and then I can like make sense of it. And then I can actually see a thread of the real truth, a thread of the heart truth that I call them tender truths, right? That we're like so protective of like, oh my gosh, when it feels like taking your shirt off when you say it out loud, you're just like, oh, I'm so exposed, right? But it doesn't feel good until you complete that whole process.
I think we want to feel good. And I totally get that. Of course, we all want to feel good. But I liken a lot of my work to physical like processes because I think people
Yes.
understand that. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like you want the feeling of having, I know you're a runner, like
Yeah.
I'm not, but like, I was like, you want the feeling of having crossed to the finish line, the
Yes.
marathon,
Mm-hmm.
but like no one wants to do the training.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
no one
Yes.
like, and or to push through at like mile 10 when you're like, I don't want to do another 14 miles. This fucking sucks. And I hate it.
Yes.
And it feels
Yes.
horrible. And I'm tired,
Mm-hmm.
and the good parts come after the difficult parts.
For sure.
And that's just actually how life works. And to be honest, I really these days frame it as like, that's what maturity is.
Oh, I love that.
Like, that's what it means to be an adult. Like, a kid
Yes.
doesn't do that because there's a level of immaturity that is appropriate
Mm-hmm.
to a child. But as adults, we're actually meant to have developed the resiliency and the ability
Mm-hmm.
to be in discomfort and not quit. And a lot of us didn't have that modeled and in healthy ways. We had that modeled
Mm-hmm.
in unhealthy ways, but we didn't have that modeled in healthy ways. We didn't have the skills taught to us. We it didn't come naturally for us. And so that can be really hard, but like that's a skill that is worth learning because it will change your life if you can learn how to be in that discomfort and do the
Mm-hmm.
parts that don't feel good so that you can have the amazingness on the other side.
For sure. And oh my gosh, I love that visual of the child, right? Who doesn't yet know impulse control or who doesn't yet know healthy regulation. And then over time, it's like, it really is like once you know it, you are now to practice it and to embody it and to grow into it. And because I think when we're younger, we're not really aware of depth, right? So we're aware of like connection, need, survival, instinct. And then as we get older, we actually do crave a depth. And especially, I'll speak for myself. When I hit 35, it was like the bottom dropped out of my world. And I would have told you I was a very together woman at 35. Like things were rocking, right? I was like married to my, husband who's incredible. We were expecting a baby. Like it was just like, this all is exactly what I wanted. And I feel like my life imploded from an identity perspective. And now the bottom has fallen out and I feel like I'm back at ground zero. And what's really going on? And what was really going on that I uncovered, right, through doing my dumps and like sorting through everything and finding the through lines and the tender truth is that there was this craving for a depth that I hadn't experienced before. And that was emotionally, and that was with regard to connecting with my family, my parents, right? It was no longer, let me get the business revenue, let me get the material things, let me get the car, let me get the home, let me get the look. It really became about, how do I move in a way that creates these beautiful organic moments between people and amongst people and in my daily experience that I can't order off of Amazon, that I can't bottle up and take as a supplement every morning. Like that's what it became about. And the only way you get there, Jen, I'm sure you know, is with vulnerability, right? Like vulnerability is a ticket.
It's the only way you get there.
Yeah.
Right? It's intimacy, it's vulnerability, it's like that is depth. And and I don't think that you're alone with that like moment of like,
Yeah.
wait, something's off. And I think for a long time we've just labeled that different things, right? We've labeled that the midlife crisis. We've labeled that like even like the menopause journey for
Oh
women,
my gosh.
right?
Yeah.
Which so much of that is that wake up of like, what is this? Like, there's got to be something more to life on that emotional lens that
Yeah.
the physical symptoms, I think, really wake up. And we know this. We know this to be true. We have so many studies and facts and numbers that say that, adults 40 past, right? Like there's a lot of different points in which this comes on for different people. But I do think all of it boils down to, is this it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, for
Like,
sure.
where's the depth? Where's the
Yep.
connection? Where's the realness?
Mm-hmm.
That in a perfect world, like that wouldn't happen because we would have been developing it our whole lives. But for those of us who weren't, and we're maybe a little bit more in that achieving, me too,
Mm-hmm.
like achievement focus, like there's that wake up call that's just like, we've got to do something about this.
Yeah, definitely. And really, the depth came in that space. And my husband and I had really been working on it early on because we were, of course, opposite attachment styles. I'm like the avoidant. I lean more avoidant. He leans more anxious. And so once we figured that out, then we had to like learn how to argue, right? Because if not, we weren't going to make it. And we decided we really wanted to make it. So we learned how to disagree and how to navigate that. And then when I hit 35 and then you have like this, I had this just divine concoction of like, you're just going to be reborn because you're going to step back from your business, which my identity was very tied to at that period of time in my life. You're going to have this baby, which again, another huge portal leap. You're going to get married to the man of your dreams that you like is so a part of your dreams, you didn't even know it. And then like just all of these wonderful things, which I have this belief that answered prayers are just as dysregulating as unanswered prayers. In
Absolutely.
moments where it's like we still get to regulate ourselves and grow into that. And it was really like, okay, so we went from learning how to disagree to learning how to utilize and leverage conflict as an opportunity for greater intimacy. And I have seen you, and I've only seen you really, Jen, bring this forward, which is so timely, just from a social perspective, a cultural perspective, right? Of like this idea, and I think it's a truth, but this idea that maybe rupture, maybe conflict is actually really good for us. And maybe if we knew how to lean into it, something might come of it that's better than we might have imagined. Can you speak more to that?
Absolutely. I think this is such an important part of vulnerability, right? Because and I understand why it scares people so much because most of us have some level of relational wounding and attachment wounding. And even people who are pretty securely attached, like there's still moments where it's like, oh, this is really scary, right? We have connection. And conflict and rupture is where we're most likely to lose connection. And that makes it very vulnerable inherently and scary. But I really have seen that conflict and rupture is an opportunity for the most growth, intimacy, and connection that like we ever experience.
Mhm.
And when we think about it, it's just an opportunity to get to know someone better.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity to see them in a different way, to be seen in a different way, to connect at a deeper level, to understand someone a little bit more. It's a great opportunity for us to look at what's happening for us
Yeah.
rather than just kick the responsibility off to someone else. Like,
Sure.
why did that thing that was actually pretty small, even if it didn't feel small to me, create such a big reaction inside of me?
Mhm.
Like, so it's also a huge invitation for self relationship and self healing and self intimacy.
Yeah.
And I think conflict is how we actually build strong relationships. Like, I always say you don't really know what kind of relationship you have with someone until after the first major rupture or
For
conflict.
sure.
And
For
then you figure
sure.
out who they really are and how strong that relationship really is.
Yes. Yes. It's like oh my gosh, yes. Because and I really, really, really relate to this because my idea is like, you actually don't know who you are until you've been tested, until you're faced with uncertainty. You realize how attached you are to an outcome, how emotionally invested you've been, how in control you thought you were, only to have this moment of realizing you're totally not. And who are you going to be? Right. And like that whole idea of like, when you squeeze an orange, you don't get apple juice, you get orange juice. And so, like, when you're squeezed, what comes out, And oh, it's so humbling.
It
At least
is.
in my experience, it's so humbling because it's so dynamic, right? Like, there are times when I've been squeezed and I'm like, oh, that came out. I get to look at that now. I'm not so proud of it. Maybe there's some shame in there. Maybe there's some embarrassment in there. Maybe there's some guilt in there. And I get to clean that up, right? Now that I know that it's there, I get to clean that up and really come into alignment with myself and honesty with myself and others. And then there's other times where I'm squeezed and I'm like, that's gold. That's so beautiful. That's gold. I've grown, like I'm so proud of me and who I've become. And so it's really dynamic. And I love that idea that like the conflict is not just about the other person and what they've done and the actions that they decided to take or not take, right? It's also about what in me is not okay with this and what about my thinking has says this is not okay and what is this bringing up for me and what are the feelings here and what are because the greatest moment of vulnerability is when my husband makes a move and I feel emotionally injured and I personalize it and project it onto him rather than taking full accountability of this is what's happening in me. And I would love to understand more about what unfolded because I feel scared. I feel nervous. I feel like, what if you leave? Or what if I leave? Because I feel so scared that I don't want to bring it to you, right? Avoidant, because I don't want to bring it to you because I don't want you to know that I could be, weak in any kind of way. And oh my gosh, that practice, that ability has created a dynamic where people do say to us, like, I want what you have. I want what you guys have. And it's like such a beautiful thing to hear. And it also, in the same breath, is like your metaphor earlier of like, maybe you want to run that half marathon, but like, dang, you got to get through mile 10, girl. Like, you got to, like, it's coming for you. And like, will you be able to be with the discomfort? Will you be able to be with the weekly runs that you get to do and be bored and be in pain and be sore and be, because that's what's required of to create that. It's a part of the alchemy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the thing where it's like, I mean, conflict, I love that like squeeze analogy. And it's like all the things you said, though, are really vulnerability. Like,
Mm,
right?
mm-hmm.
The things that feel embarrassing, things that feel shameful, the things that cause guilt.
Yeah.
It all is vulnerability. But
Mm-hmm.
also on the other side, the things that cause like pride and like
Mm-hmm.
joy and
Mm-hmm.
a sense of accomplishment, that is usually equally vulnerable for people.
Sure.
to be seen in that and to not frame it in a certain way and to not try to manipulate it or adjust
Yep.
it for an outcome, that's really vulnerable. And so, like if conflict is is this beautiful thing that squeezes out vulnerability in
Yep.
us, it's like it pushes us through to these next levels if we can do it, if we don't shut down, right?
Yeah.
If we can build the emotional resilience, sometimes referred to as like emotional cardio, right? It's like you don't just get up and run the half marathon.
No.
Like you start by walking around the block a couple times and like doing a mile, and like,
But you know what's so funny, Jen? I have to
yeah,
confess is that I've done that before. And it was in the
you just
time of my life
did it.
when I was not practicing vulnerability, right? I was unwilling to feel weak, but I really was that woman that was like, I'm just going to sign up for a half marathon. And then I felt awful,
Yeah.
right? Because I wasn't practiced. So like I did it and I finished it, but
Yeah.
I was like a zombie death walking and out for a week. And just like, so it can be done. And it can also be done like my most recent one where it was like, I feel fantastic. Like I'm in the gym the next day. I'm not sore. I feel good. So that context is so critical of like that emotional resiliency. And then also, and you've probably seen this in your work with clients too, is that knowing of self is so important in this as well. Because it's like the example that I'm thinking of is like the way in which we communicate, and especially in relationship and in business, because you'll have these moments with clients where you're like, oh, I don't want to lose the client. I got to face off with this, but I don't want to lose the client. But if I don't speak my truth and I collapse and I doormat, now I'm the enabler. Now I'm the one that's created the codependent dynamic with this client or this contract or whatever it is. And that's not an integrity, right? And that's also not for the best outcome for anyone in this situation. So it's so important that we know who we are and what we're about and what we stand for and our principles, and that we lean into those. And like, I see it as almost like anchoring into those and really staying with them as we navigate this vulnerability, right? As we go into this space of maybe conflict or resolution or rupture, whatever it is, because that's the come from, right? It's like who we be and who we're committed to being in these places and spaces where vulnerability is coming from all sides and everybody is vulnerable and everybody's feeling exposed and everybody is in uncertainty. And how do we lead in that space? And I think that identity and knowing who we are and what we're about is critical to the leadership in those situations.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you brought up, like, I have actually just ran the marathon, right? And like,
I don't recommend that.
because here's the deal. It's like, you can do it without the training, but it's harmful.
Oh, yeah,
There's
totally.
harm that is done afterward.
Yes.
And then that oftentimes means that people don't want to do it again,
Mm-hmm.
which is what happens a lot of times with vulnerability and conflict. They
Yep.
don't know what they're doing. They like don't have any resiliency. There's no cardio. You can push through and force it. And there's harm, there's damage, there's an
Mm-hmm.
injury
Mm-hmm.
that makes it
Yep.
really hard to do it
Yep.
again, but
Yeah.
that's why we need to have places where we are building these skills over time
Mm-hmm.
and bringing that awareness in. I believe that, like, in a lot of ways, I'd say like most people don't know themselves. They know their strategies.
Yes.
They know their trauma reactions. They know the
Mm-hmm.
lenses in which they see the world through. But very few people actually truly know themselves,
Yep.
like underneath all of that. And even, I've been doing this work for over a decade and I feel like I know myself pretty well. And I still am always, I went to a conference like 3 weeks ago and was like, came out being like, what the hell? This major piece of my identity I think might be wrong. Like,
Yeah.
I think it was a
Mm-hmm.
protection. And like,
Yeah.
wow, like
Yep.
this huge piece of like, wow, maybe I didn't know myself
Mm-hmm.
fully in these ways. And so the more that we can do the work of self awareness
Mm-hmm.
and of strengthening and resilience building emotionally, the more we're able to even be
Yes.
aware of like, oh, I'm about ready to cross my own boundaries and communicate
Mm-hmm.
with this client, or I'm going to get defensive and be like, I don't need you, whatever, leave, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the opposite,
Yes.
rather than leaning in. Like we can't do conflict without those kind of skills. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a really important part of leadership.
For sure. And when you were talking about, like just signing up for a marathon and having it be like potentially harmful or leaving that experience being like, I don't want to run a marathon again. Like the other thing that in that experience that I'm now aware of is that because of my lack of training and preparation, my unwillingness, that's what it was. It was unwillingness to be a part of the training and the preparation. I didn't get the joy. I didn't get, I mean, now at this point in my life, right? Like I feel so happy. I get those moments of like the runner's high and the goodness and the community and the belonging that comes from engaging in something like this. And that's because of the willingness to build the muscles and be in preparation and really, dare I say, submit to a process of learning and unbecoming and unlearning so that I can access the truth of what lives in me and also what's created by me within me. And that's the thing that I think your work does so beautifully with people is that it gives them a really safe space to be in that ick that is inevitable, right? Like I would be totally lying and a fraud if I told you that there's not going to be any ick. Like yesterday, right? I did a 5 mile run and I was like, ick. The first three were not cute. And then the last two were pretty cute. So it's this alchemical process, but it wasn't the marathon's fault that I didn't have a good time. It wasn't the setting. Like every 13.1 miles is 13.1 miles. It's like at the gym, every 20-pound dumbbell is a 20-pound dumbbell. That's what it is. The only thing that shows up differently to the 20-pound dumbbell is me. And so like what's going on with me? And that's why I love like weight training as a life dojo, because it's like, look, the weight is the same every single time I walk in there, but I am not. And so what's here for me today to get curious about, but this encouragement of, I can't tell you what vulnerability work is going to create in you or create in your life. What I can tell you is you'll be better for it and your life will be better for it and your children will be better for it and your teams will be better for it. Because if you think that you're going to get a bunch of people in a room or you think that you're going to have a family and nobody's ever going to disagree with each other, right? And you're never going to be navigating conflict with them, you're not connected to what's here on planet Earth that's happening, you know?
I love this piece that you said around like, I did the marathon, but I didn't actually get the good out of it because I actually think that what you just said is really profound when we apply it to life. In that I think that's how a lot of us live our lives. Like, check,
Mm-hmm.
partner, marriage, kids, great job, right? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
did it kind of, quote unquote, I did it. I've achieved it.
Yep.
Because you still get to walk out of the marathon that you didn't actually have a good time at and say, like, I
I got
ran.
a medal.
Yeah, I got a medal. Like,
It still goes on Instagram,
yeah,
right?
I did it, right? Like, yeah, it goes on as like, yeah, look at me, right? That achievement portion, but you don't get the actual internal satisfaction and all the goodness and the purpose and the alignment and the pleasure and the joy and the satisfaction and all these words that sound like buzzwords these days, but are really absent from most people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can trace it directly back to I'm unwilling to do
Mm-hmm.
the process.
Yep.
Like, and it's not to some extent, I kind of call BS on anyone who's like, I just don't know how these days.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. My parents, they didn't have there wasn't a million books and
Yep.
opportunities, but these days, and it's everywhere. Like
Yes.
this work is everywhere. It's very like top of
Mm-hmm.
culture. So the idea that we don't have access to it is not true, but the number of people who are willing to experience discomfort is still very low, quite honestly.
Yeah.
Even in the work that we do, like
Sure.
even in the marketing and coaching and business entrepreneurship where like a lot of people are talking about these things.
Mm-hmm.
What I found is the actual willingness to do it behind the scenes is still rare.
Yeah. And I love the sentiment of like, if you have a phone, you have access to vulnerability work. You have access to absolutely almost anything, really, if that phone has an internet connection. And it's such a different experience to know it in your head, right? That difference between like knowledge versus embodiment. And like, I know it. I know it in my head. I know I'm not supposed to eat dairy. I know I'm not supposed to, right? Like do this thing. And yet that embodiment of it is a whole different game because that's when you get to really actually experience the alchemy that happens because it does transcend the logical mind in many ways of how that could happen in my life. And I would attribute it to vulnerability work, or I would attribute it to coaching, or I would contribute to personal development. But if you looked at it from the outside and you'd be like, there's no way that personal development created that for you. And I'm like, well, I didn't access it without it. So I can't guarantee you that personal development work is going to help bring you your partner or have you, have an incredible lifestyle that you want or whatever that is. But I haven't been able to access all of this without personal development work. In fact, it was a key component in what I experience now, which I would consider to be really fantastic, really beautiful. And the thing that I personally am wrestling with now is like sharing that out loud, right? That vulnerability of like bringing the joy forward, this is what's exciting for me right now. This is what's alive right now. This is what's I'm really so grateful for. Like the other night, my husband and I were walking through something and we just stopped and we looked at each other and we're like, we're so proud of us. Like I'm so proud of us because if we had a camera crew that followed us around every single day and captured everything, like I would be so proud for the world to see it because it's so through and through. You know what I mean? It's so legit. And my goodness, that feels really liberating, And
It's amazing.
yeah.
My best friend and business partner, we have like this beautiful partnership and
Mm. Oh yeah.
and we've recently hit this kind of a similar point where it's like we're just constantly like today we were on the phone. It's like we're just so proud of us, like it's like this like
Yes.
we made it through and while it's a like non-romantic partnership,
Yeah.
it's funny because it like followed a lot of the similar pattern
Sure.
of like
Yeah.
any marriage or partnership. And so we had all these moments of like, you don't appreciate me. You don't appreciate me. Like I do more than you. No,
Sure.
I do more than you. Like this is very like typical patterns, right?
Yeah.
And to dig in and make it through to the other side, there is this sense of like, this is so wildly satisfying. And
Mhm.
and like anyone could film our day to day. And I'd be really proud about that. And
Mhm.
and I think that there's this beautiful piece of I agree. I mean, a lot of my work, it feels very tangential. Like I'm like,
Mhm.
people like, what do I get out of this? And I'm like, you'll feel better. Be happier, like, everything will feel more satisfying.
Mhm.
It doesn't always feel as specific as, like business coaching or numbers.
Oh my gosh,
Some of
yes.
that's
Yeah.
and you can't promise that someone will have this amazing life or meet their partner, but what I do know is that if you don't do vulnerability, conflict work, if you get that quote unquote Instagram life and that
Mhm.
partner, you won't enjoy it. If you don't have these pieces in place, it'll look a certain way on the
Mhm.
outside and it won't feel fulfilling. It won't
Yeah.
feel satisfying. You won't feel connected.
Mhm.
You won't be fed by it. You won't appreciate it, And I think
Yeah.
that is a really important piece of like understanding that this is why so many people look like they have great lives.
Mhm.
And then, we hear all these kind of cultural stories of like, oh, they always seemed happy, but
Sure.
they were actually miserable the whole time, or they blew up their marriage, or they were having an affair,
Yeah.
they took their own life, or any number of
Mhm.
things like that were like, oh, I don't understand. And I'm like, I do. I
Mhm.
understand. I know
Mhm.
exactly what was happening in that situation.
Yeah.
And it was a lack
Mhm.
of vulnerability.
Oh my gosh. And it's really heartbreaking because again, right, it reminds me of that there's an author, Brianne West. Is that her name? She wrote The Mountain Is You. It's a fantastic, I think that's her name. Anyway, she has this quote where she said, there are things in this life that are so good that you wouldn't know to even ask for them. And from where I sit, I come from a similar lineage of you, right? Psychotherapist to coaching and in psychotherapy, you learn to be the blank canvas, right? You're actually not encouraged to be vulnerable. You're encouraged to hold space. And their version of holding space is very different than what unfolds now. But I say all that to say that vulnerability work is the thing that helps you to experience the things in life that you wouldn't know to even ask for, but they show up and you're like, wow, you're astonished, I experienced that quite frequently. I'm like, whoa, and that is where life becomes nourishing. And I feel like I say that to my clients, especially on like when they're inquiring about like services and stuff. And they're like, what is coaching with you like? What do we do? And I'm like, you really can live a life that's very nourishing, where you're actually not depleted all the time, where you aren't running on fumes and you don't have, oh my gosh, I can't even think of the word. It's so foreign to me. What is it? Where you work too hard, burnout.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait, where's the word? Where that's actually not a thing, that's available. And sometimes when I say that, I feel people look at me like I'm speaking a foreign language, it's like, oh my gosh, but it's not, it's just being available and willing to do the vulnerability work, to unlearn and then to learn how to redesign your life according to your own unique constitution, which again, confronting. And once you embody that, nobody's questioning you.
It's so, it's so interesting. Like we assume that life has to be only certain ways, but it doesn't. It doesn't have that way. Like I feared having a teenager for a long time because of how many stories there is about how the teenagers are the worst. But the teenagers with my daughter have been the best. Like, and we're super close. And people hear about our relationship and they're like, that's like the unicorn, right? That. Right? Like, she's 17 and she still wants to cuddle with me and hang out with me. And we have this like really beautiful bond. And I'm like, yeah, but that didn't happen out of accident. That wasn't luck.
Oh, yeah.
That was work. That was really, really, that was a lot of work that I did. And, and I think like we miss that. One of the things I love to say about my work is I help people get if I won the lottery ticket life without ever buying a lottery ticket. Like,
yes.
And that's not it can look like, boat trips in Croatia and like,
right.
beautiful villas in Europe. Sure, it could.
Yeah.
But what people really want is how they think that would make them feel.
Yes.
They don't actually want that. They want how they think it would make them feel. And we all have access to that all the time if we're willing to be in the process and the hard and the mess and the like, I don't even know what I'm doing, the discomfort.
Yeah.
Like on the other side is more than you could imagine. And that's what makes vulnerability work so special.
Yes. Oh my goodness. And Jen, where do we find more of you? Because I know there's going to be people listening that are like, I'm ready to have more of this. I'm willing now.
Social media is a great place to find me. Instagram, it's Jen Underwood Leadership. Facebook, we'll put the link to my personal Facebook page where I do most of my work. And then my website online, which is jenunderwoodleadership.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jen. Yeah. You're such a gift. And I'm so grateful that we got to have you today.
Thanks for having me.
As we complete this episode, I would love to know your insights, takeaways, and feedback. You can message me on Instagram at Katie Lynn Rojano or send them via email to katie@katielynnrojano.com. Any products or digital downloads I mentioned can be found via the link in my Instagram bio. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share it with at least one friend and leave a 5-star review so we can get these impactful dialogues into the lives of even more people. I would also like to thank my guest for their vulnerability and generosity in allowing us to learn from them and grow alongside them. Until next time, friends, let's go beyond.